Hey guys, it's Kevin, or RaceGN77 if you're coming to me from over on there at the Car Guy forums. And today I wanted to go over oxygen sensor testing. How they work, what you should be looking for, some problems you can come into while you're testing them, some things that will fool you, and just a basic going over fuel trim, oxygen sensors, the basics. First things first, oxygen sensor is what it sounds like. It's a sensor in the system that tells the computer how much oxygen has been left over after combustion is completed. And based on this information, the computer will alter the fuel trim or the injection pulse on time to either add more fuel or take fuel away depending on what is shown in the exhaust system. And one thing you have to remember when looking at an oxygen sensor is oxygen sensor cannot pick up anything other than oxygen content. It cannot tell the computer if there's raw fuel, if there's coolant, if there's anything else in the exhaust system. The computer does not know. All it knows is how much oxygen's there, and it will make its determinations based on that. A lot of times you have an injection misfire where a injector's jammed open, or you're getting an ignition misfire where you're getting nothing but fuel out of that cylinder. And a lot of times you'll still show a lean code, and the reason that is because the oxygen sensor can't detect raw fuel. And since that fuel's not being burned, that means the oxygen's not being consumed. And since the oxygen's not being consumed, it's being shoved into the cylinder and out through the exhaust manifold as raw oxygen, and the computer will see that and will say, hey, you have a lean condition, when in actuality you actually have a rich condition. So I've got the truck here. This is a 94 S10. It's the older style, OBD1, and I'm just going to go over some basic oxygen sensor work since this is a single wire sensor. And enough to get you started and get you an idea of what fuel trim is like on these vehicles. So first, let me bring you over here where you can see the scan tool. Let's come on down here. Alright. You can see my voltmeter hooked up. The voltmeter is hooked up through a T-pin directly to the O2 sensor. As you can see in this back here, you see this little jumper wire. This jumper wire is going straight to a T-pin that's connected where the O2 sensor connects to the computer harness. And so right now, the oxygen sensor is showing 187 millivolts, and that is because there is just a slight amount less oxygen in the exhaust stream than there is outside. And the reason that you're seeing a voltage even though the vehicle is off is because an O2 sensor works quite simply by the ratio of the oxygen outside the sensor to the ratio of the oxygen inside the sensor produces a voltage in the sensor. And the greater the difference between the two, the greater the voltage. Since the amount of oxygen inside the exhaust stream on my truck is almost equal to the amount of oxygen outside the exhaust stream, the voltage is very little, 186 millivolts. If there was a lot less oxygen inside the exhaust system, if the vehicle was running, that voltage would come way up to almost, if it's rich, it comes up to about 900 millivolts. And the purpose of the computer is to keep that voltage as close to 450 millivolts as possible so the O2 sensor can switch rich and lean and the computer can make adjustments. Now if you have a problem like a intake leak or a leaking injector or something that's causing a rich running condition or a lean running condition, the computer will make alterations to the fuel trim until it can get this voltage back to where it can switch again. And that's what you call your fuel trim. If your fuel trims are in the positive, the computer is having to add fuel to get this back to where it's supposed to be. If your fuel trims are in the negative, the computer is having to subtract fuel to get this fuel trims back to where they're supposed to be. Now in these older, especially Chevys, they used what was called block learn and integrator. Block learn just basically means long-term fuel trim. Integrator is short-term fuel trim. Where normally you would see 0% on your fuel trim for a vehicle that's running correctly, on block learn and integrator you see 128. If the number is less than 128, the computer is taking away fuel. It sees a rich condition. If it's more than 128, it's the computer is adding fuel because it sees a lean condition. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to add some propane to this engine and you'll see where the voltage goes and the block learn goes. And we'll lean the engine out. And then we'll induce a couple intentional misfires, let you see what happens to fuel trim and to the O2 sensor when a misfire occurs. So, get this turned back on. Let's see if I can get you set up where you can see the scan tool better. Oh, gotta love cables. Alright, let's zoom in on the scan tool so I can show you what's going on inside this. As you can see here, the first line is block learn, and that's your long term. And my truck's set at 121. Perfect is 128, so it's pretty close. It's had to subtract a little bit of fuel, so this engine's running just a tad rich, but it's actually well within spec, so it's nothing to worry about. BLM cell. Block learn is divided into cells, and each cell has its own set of long and short term fuel trims. And each cell is determined by engine load and RPM, and sometimes engine coolant temperature. And based on these, the computer will actually create a multitude of cells, and they're all come pre-programmed with fuel to air ratio information. And as the vehicle runs, it looks at all the information and can determine if that cell needs more fuel, less fuel, to keep that engine operating properly, to keep the O2 sensor swapping, keep the voltage where it needs to be, so that the catalytic converter can do its job and remove as much contamination from the exhaust as possible. Engine coolant 103. It's been off for a little while now. Diagnostic state, road, just means that it's in a normal, the computer's in normal drive state. If you saw field, that's a field service state, which means you're doing some work to it. Road, it just means the computer's set up as normal as it would be going down the road. Injector pulse width. That's how long the injectors are being held open. Of course, the engine's off, keys on, so we're at 0 milliseconds. The injectors are not being pulsed at this moment. And you'll see that change as I do different things to the engine to create lean and rich conditions. You'll see it reflected in this as the computer shortens the pulse width to get fuel out of the system, or adds to the pulse width to get more fuel into the system. Integrator is the short term. It's set at 128. Loop status, of course, we're in open loop, keys on, engines off. Open loop means that the computer is not using the O2 sensor to determine any mixtures at this time. It goes to close when the oxygen sensor is hot enough to start performing, and then the computer uses the oxygen sensor to determine how much fuel. But prior to that, when it's an open loop, it uses a fixed number at the factory, and it cannot change that. It will not be able to make any changes until this goes from open to close, and then the computer can start making alterations. And of course, the O2 fuel state, we're lean because the engine's off. There's almost equal air inside and outside the sensor, so it's producing a very small voltage, as you can see, 0.18, which matches this, 0.18. And basically what happens is, because of this condition it's in right now, we're not getting any voltage produced by the O2 sensor. What you're seeing here, where you're seeing these little spikes run across the screen, is bias voltage. The computer is actually pulsing up to the bias. There it comes down the string. And you'll see that jump to 0.46. That is the bias voltage on the system. The computer is actually trying to see if something's wrong right now. Even though it knows the engine's not running, it's double checking the O2 sensor voltage to make sure this number is truly what it should be. Another thing you got to look for is you always want to verify your O2 voltage. If you're doing O2 sensor code diagnostics, you want to verify that with a multimeter. Because I have seen PCMs go bad, and this number, because you got to remember, the computer's interpreting all this information, processing it, and then sending it to my scan tool. My scan tool's processing it and showing it to me here. And I have seen PCMs go bad and scan tools go bad where this information's incorrect, and you want to go straight to the sensor, as I used to say, straight to the horse's mouth, and find out what the real deal is. And if you show something completely different here than you're seeing here, then you need to check your wiring. If your wiring checks out, then you know you either have a bad PCM or bad scan tool. And what I'd recommend is swapping out scan tools, verifying that the numbers are the same. If they are, you got a bad PCM. If they aren't, you may have a bad scan tool, or a scan tool that's acting silly and not giving you the information you need. So let's start the truck up, and we're going to let it sit and idle, and we'll look at what it should normally look like on a properly running vehicle. can see, engine is running now. We're still in open loop mode. As you see, there's still a very low amount of voltage generated by the O2 sensor. And the reason that is because the computer is not making any fuel changes to the O2 sensor yet. We're just now going in a closed loop, and we should start seeing some voltage changes here as the O2 comes into play and starts to generate a voltage. Remember, as long as that engine's cold, that O2 sensor's cold, it's not going to generate voltage. It does not work properly until it's up to operating temperature, at least 600 degrees Fahrenheit. You can still see I'm in a warm-up mode. About 3 milliseconds of open time. That's rich. The computer's trying to get the engine warmed up. Integrator's gone way up. It's going rich because, of course, it's still in a warm-up mode, so it's adding more fuel than normal to get everything up to spec. Let's give it some fuel, get the engine temperature up enough to get this O2 sensor working. Go. Now, as you can see, we have switching. O2 sensor's doing what it's supposed to. You're seeing a lean rich. You're seeing voltage swing up and down. You can see it on the voltmeter here. Low voltage, then high voltage, back to low voltage. I mean, low voltage is lean, high voltage is rich. That switching means the computer is taking control of the fuel system and it's changing the pulse width. As you can see right here, not very much. It's only about a tenth of a millisecond of change in pulse width to go from rich to lean. The computer's in full control of the fuel system right now. It is short-term fuel trim is holding about 120. That would be on these newer vehicles. You'd probably be looking at about 3%. But this is what a normal operating system should look like. Back and forth, rich lean, and it's still not 100% yet because the engine coolant's still pretty cold. We're only at 136 degrees Fahrenheit. That O2 sensor is warm enough to start operating, but it will not reach best operating mode till it gets up to full engine temperature. Until that manifold is up to about 800 degrees Fahrenheit, that sensor's still going to be kind of lazy. As the engine warms up, it'll get much better, and you'll get quicker switching and a much cleaner looking graph here as the voltage comes up and comes down. So let's get this thing up a little bit warmer. Notice something else. As I rev this engine up, the block learned cell changes from 16. It's going to change to 1. And what that is with the unloaded engine at a higher RPM, the fuel control table for this engine's under block learned cell 1. Once we go back to an idle condition, with no load, the block learned cell is 16. Now you can see we're up to temperature now, up to a much better temperature now. We're getting a better switching on the O2. And let's make some changes. Let's introduce a rich running condition and see what happens. Now what we're going to do here is I'm going to inject propane into the engine. Which is going to make the engine run rich. Injects, ooh, almost too much. Okay, now as you see, as I put propane in there, we run rich. The O2 sensor is lined out at a high voltage. And the integrator is going down to compensate. See, it's counting down. Fuel trim is taking away fuel. Your pulse width is shortened to, you can see it's coming pretty short. It's trying to come down there to take fuel away. And what's going to happen is it climbs down through this integrator. It's going to keep climbing down until this can start switching again. See, it's tried there. See if we can get this to switch. And see what's happening is the block learn, if you notice up here at the top, the block learn has come way down to 102. Let me zoom you back in here so you can see a little bit better. Love cables. One of these days I may get me one of these wireless units. There we go. Let's see if I can get you out of the glare so you can see the numbers. There we go. It's not perfect, but I think you can see that now. Block learn has come all the way down to 90. It's compensated for the rich running condition by coming all the way down to subtracting fuel. The integrator is all the way down to, you know, floating between 90 and 100, still running rich. And what we're going to do is slowly close that valve back off. Now we're getting back to a switching state. Oh. Okay, let me take a look at that real quick. Alright, we came unplugged there, and that's why we lost all our data flow. Now we've closed back off the propane, so we're back to a normal running condition. Now as you watch, that integrator, this block learn up here, and the integrator will come back to where they're supposed to be. You're going to see this, the computer's compensating because this is so low, it's adding more fuel than it needs now. I shut the rich condition off. And this integrator is climbing up to start subtracting fuel to get the engine adding fuel and subtracting fuel, trying to get everything back to normal. This should start counting back up to close to 128 again now that the condition's taken care of. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add some air to the engine, and let's go ahead and cause a slight lean condition. Alrighty. Yeah, there's still that glare on that. Ah, there we go. hard to get this scan tool to sit exactly where you want it so a camera can pick it up. There we go. Now we're back in glare again. Alright, now next what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect an injector. And so now we have a misfire. Now you're going to notice right off the bat, the injector pulse width is 1.9 milliseconds. The computer's picking up that injector misfire. The injector's unplugged, so there's one cylinder that's only pushing air right now. Voltage is still switching, and that's because it's going into a higher block learn cell to compensate for this lean condition. It's doing the opposite of what I did when I gave it propane. This is now counting up, and the integrator is counting up. You can see how high the integrator is. That's how this engine's compensating for a lean condition. If I were to pull this vehicle in the bay and just go to look at it, just this data, I can see that there's something causing a lean condition. It doesn't tell me what, but something is causing this engine to run lean. You can still see that. And you see we're all the way up to 115 on the block learn. It's still climbing up. It's still trying to compensate for this lean condition. Said we got one cylinder, it's not receiving any fuel, so the computer knows how much fuel should be, how much oxygen should be left over, and that extra cylinder's worth of oxygen without any combustion taking place is adding more oxygen to the exhaust than the computer likes. So the computer's compensating by adding more fuel coming up through this, and then you can actually see it add more fuel through the pulse width. The pulse width's almost 2 milliseconds. So let's plug this injector back up. And then we'll see the computer do the opposite. Alright, we got her plugged back up. Let's take a look. Now we got to give it a few seconds here to compensate. Now we've got normal operating fuel and oxygen content coming through the system, and the computer is going to have to compensate again. As you can see, it's already come down to 1.6, 1.5 milliseconds. The block learn is stopped at 130, and the computer's quit counting because it knows it doesn't need to keep going up, and it's probably going to start compensating really soon by counting down. And you're going to see these start to fall back towards where they should be. Still getting the switching. If you notice this flat spot, that's where we had it disconnected. Now we're switching again. Because once I hooked that injector back up for a few seconds, the mixture was too rich. The computer's been adding fuel through the other injectors to compensate for the one that was disconnected. As soon as I hooked it back up, that injector starts firing fuel. Now the system's rich. You saw that line out where it reached for a few seconds, and then the computer starts compensating immediately. It starts changing the integrator and block learn or fuel trims to get back to where it should be. Now sometimes I get asked, what about a spark misfire? When a spark misfire cause a rich running condition? And the answer is no. And the reason that is because without any combustion, the fuel going in that cylinder is raw, and it's going to be dumped into the exhaust manifold raw, and the computer can't detect that. But because there's no combustion going on, that means the oxygen going into that cylinder is completely unaltered on a chemical state, and it exits the cylinder just like it did when I unhooked the injector. And I'm going to show you that. I'm going to cause a misfire, and you'll see the same thing happen. Okay, now we have a spark misfire. You're going to see that the pulse width is back up. The computer's compensating for it the same exact way it did when I unhooked an injector. it cannot see that raw fuel that's now being dumped into the exhaust manifold, because the O2 sensor only picks up oxygen. All it sees is the extra oxygen that's left over because that fuel did not ignite and did not burn. So the computer's going to compensate the same way. It thinks it's a lean running condition. The block learn's still high. The integrator's going high. And the injector pulse width is back almost to 2 milliseconds to compensate. So an injector misfire and a ignition misfire, the computer sees the same thing. It cannot tell the difference as far as O2 sensor goes. It cannot tell the difference between the two. It just sees that there's more oxygen than it should be. So if you have ignition misfire, not only are you wasting fuel coming through that cylinder, you also have the other cylinders wasting fuel because now the computer's sending more fuel than should be to them. So this engine will actually consume a lot of fuel in a short period of time in this condition. The computer thinks it's lean. It's actually rich. So the computer is going to compensate by making the mixture even richer. So let's hook that back up. You don't want to leave these disconnected for very long. It can cause some serious damage to the engine. And you see where it's riched out. It riched out for a few seconds as I hook that back up, because now the fuel's being burnt. Now the computer can actually see the oxygen content come down, and for a few seconds the system's rich until it starts to get control. You can see this pulse width is coming down. We're now at about 1.5 milliseconds. And as you can notice, we didn't look at it very much through the whole thing, but the entire time I did have the voltmeter hooked up, and you're getting about the same exact reading out of the voltmeter as we are the computer, so we know that the computer's information is good, is valid, and is working like it's supposed to. So that's it. That's just a quick introduction to fuel trim, O2 sensor operation. I'll probably do a couple more videos at a later point in time that get more in depth on this, and how to determine if O2 sensor's lazy. A good way is if we were doing this test and this truck had a bad O2 or a lazy O2 that was going bad, it would take much longer to respond to these changes than it did. These change responses were actually almost instant. If we were to do this on a vehicle that had a lazy O2 sensor, you would see these changes take much longer to take place. As the computer tries to compensate, then it's got to wait for the O2 to give it the information it needs to do this. Just something for you guys to take away more than anything else is that an O2 sensor can only sense oxygen. It cannot sense raw fuel, it cannot sense antifreeze, it cannot sense any other thing that may come through that exhaust stream. It can only pick up oxygen, and that's all it's going to do is respond to the oxygen content. So you've got to be careful. If you have a misfire and you get a code that says rich running or lean running, that doesn't always mean that you have a fuel starvation problem. You could have a regular misfire like I showed you by pulling the plug wire, and the computer still sees a lean condition because it can't see that raw fuel. So you've got to be real careful when you're diagnosing these issues and you have misfires on top of it. It's best to go a different diagnostic strategy to figure out what your misfires are, get them repaired, then come back and start doing this testing once the misfires are taken care of, so you can find out if you really do have a lean condition or not. You may have a lean completely set by ignition misfires. So I want to thank you guys for watching the video. Like I said, most of my time I'm over at Eric the Car Guy forums. Eric runs an awesome website helping people out with car repairs and trying to teach them what they need to know to keep their vehicles on the road. And my name over there is RaceGN77. You'll see me around. I'm on there quite frequently. And if you have any questions, shoot me a private message and I'll do the best I can to help you. Until next time, I want to thank you for watching it, and goodbye.